Hello, this is Brian Oughton of Apologetics315. Today I interview Dr. Glenn Peoples. Glenn is a New Zealand-based Christian philosopher, podcaster, and blogger. He runs the Beretta blog and hosts the Say Hello to My Little Friend podcast, covering issues of faith, apologetics, morality, and philosophy of religion. The purpose of this interview is to learn a bit more about Glenn and his work, as well as to ask him questions on the topic of morality and its application to Christian apologetics. Well, thanks for taking the time to join me for this interview, Glenn.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, how are things in New Zealand? It's springtime in Northern Ireland. What season is it actually there?
Well, it's how the north-south thing works. It's autumn here, which is my favorite time of year. It's not quite cold enough to be unbearable yet, and it's very, very beautiful. So, yeah, it's my favorite time of the year.
It's great to connect with you. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is to discuss one of the areas of your specialization, and that's morality and how it relates to this discussion of God. But before we get into that, first, tell our listeners a bit more about yourself, your blog, your podcast, and your areas of interest.
I started my blog called Say Hello to My Little Friend back in May 2006 while I was still working away on my PhD. And really, I just wanted a casual outlet for some of my musings at the time. Obviously, it's grown a lot since then. 2 years later, I started the podcast, which has really become the focus of the website. My postgraduate work that I was doing then was on the subject of religion in the public square. So I was looking at the acceptable role of religious presuppositions out in public and political life. And connected to that were areas like the relationship between ethics and God and the field of meta-ethics generally, kind of the big picture view of what morality really is and what underscores the whole enterprise. But apart from that, the blog and the podcast also looks at philosophy of religion in general, arguments for and against belief in God. Before I moved into philosophy, my degrees were in theology, and so I do some writing and speaking there as well. I guess I've gained a bit of a reputation for having something to say about the Christian doctrine of life after death in particular, and also human nature. So when an employer says, okay, so what are your fields of interest? They want you to just list them, 3 or 4. So I tell them philosophy of religion, ethics, political philosophy, and theology, with a hint of philosophy of mind. You don't want to spread yourself too thin, but anything within that is the kind of thing that piques my interest.
They're great resources. So if someone wanted to find your podcast and blog, where do they look online?
Well, the website is www.beretta-online.com. Now, the reason for that is that the website was called Beretta even earlier, before there was a blog, and someone said, hey, you should do a blog. But also you can find the podcast through the iTunes store, so you can just search for the title, Say Hello to My Little Friend, or Glenn Peoples as the author.
Now, some of our listeners may have viewed or listened to the recent debate between the new atheist Sam Harris. He's also authored this new book called The Moral Landscape, and he debated Christian philosopher and apologist William Lane Craig. The topic, does good come from God, or more accurately, is the foundation of morality natural or supernatural? And you've written a review of that debate as well on your blog. But this topic of moral foundations seems to me has always been an issue when discussing the question of whether or not God exists. Why is, in your view, morality such an issue in this discussion?
Yeah, I think it's the area where people anecdotally get perhaps a little more heated as well. I think it's because morality really matters to people. In spite of what some intellectuals have convinced themselves of, and this is something that Sam Harris, I think, quite correctly complains about. You get some intellectual atheists who can sort of argue themselves into believing that really there are no moral facts, but no one really believes that. We all find ourselves, I dare say, with no option but to admit that there really are moral truths that we're confronted with. We can't just shake off the fact that some of the things that people do to each other aren't just yucky or, unacceptable according to our societal convention. They're really wrong. They shouldn't happen. And the thought that what we believe, in terms of our overall view of reality, can't account for those facts is unacceptable to most people. It bothers people, as it should. It's so striking and awful that these things go on, that it can't be ignored. And that's why I think the moral argument for God's existence strikes such a chord with a lot of people. That's why so many people who don't believe in God feel that they can't just shrug it off. The moral facts are so apparent to all of us that this is an issue that really does call for a response.
As you say, not only is it a sensitive issue and people get heated, but it does address them as a person. And as soon as you say that perhaps they've done something wrong, now you're stepped right into their own personal territory between them and God, should He exist. Yeah. Now, I want to talk about this question of morality just kind of all across the board, especially in how it relates to this particular debate and others where moral arguments for the existence of God are used or employed. So, starting at ground level, what's morality?
Yeah, well, that is ground level. It's one of those things where not everyone's going to give the same answer. So I'm going to give what I think is the correct answer to how you should think about what morality is. I think that morality is about duty. To say that there really is morality is to say that we really do have duties. It's the notion that there is a way that we are meant to be and to live and act, and there is a way that if we live that way, then we are at fault, as a matter of fact, and we can be blamed. So it's the idea that there is praiseworthiness or blameworthiness in some objective sense in regard to the way we live, whether we admit it or not. So in short, I think the existence of morality means that we really do, as a matter of fact, have duties.
Some of the terms that are used would be values and duties as well. What's the difference between values and duties?
Again, it's I don't want to say that they're conventions, because obviously I'm saying that they're objective, but the way that people use those terms can become something of a convention. Some people do talk as though there's a real difference. In fact, in the recent debate between Bill Craig and Sam Harris, Bill Craig took himself to be making two quite different claims, well, related but different claims. The idea that if God exists, then we have a basis for objective moral values and duties, as though they're quite different things. I'm actually someone who thinks that really morality is all about duty, but I think that this can be translated into the language of value to convey basically the same idea. For example, when someone speaks about there being a moral worth to human life, Bill Craig may have said this at some point but in the debate, but if not, I'm sure he said it at some other time. If there's no God, then what's really valuable about human beings? So he's talking really about value, because value, when you ask someone something's value, you say, well, how much is it worth? Worth is the language of value, but I think that what makes it appropriate to speak that way is the fact that we have moral duties, because what lurks behind all of this is the fact that God values certain things like human life, and it's because God values it that He desires that we treat human life in a certain way. So to say that there is a moral worth to human life, as a matter of fact, I think it means that we have a moral duty to cherish and protect human life. So from a bird's eye view, that's how I see the notion of duty and the notion of value working together.
Would you say that values have to do with good and bad, where maybe duties would be what actions would be right and wrong, and perhaps the duties would be based in values?
No. I mean, and this is kind of a hang-up I have with a lot of moral philosophers, although I know I'm not alone. But I don't think that goodness and badness are strictly moral terms. And I think this is where Sam Harris actually gets into a lot of trouble, because he notes, for example, that something is good for you in the sense that it will, stop you from dying or suffering. And that's, I think, non-moral goodness. It's just a description. For example, you can have a good apple or a bad apple, but that doesn't say anything about moral duty. It doesn't tell you what kind of apple you should have. And so I think that goodness is the kind of thing that God loves, and that's just because of God's nature. God loves what is good for us, and God loves us. But duty comes about when we ought to promote something. And it's because God loves the good that He desires that we promote the good, and that's what gives us a duty to promote the good.
Well, some of the other terms that are used, and I think that are commonly misunderstood, would be the objective, subjective distinction, where one would say, what do you mean by objective moral values? And the common response would be, something along the lines of that it would be right or wrong regardless of someone's opinion, that it's, whereas subjective has to do with the person. Can you kind of spell out the differences a little bit better than I just did there?
Yeah, that is the right idea, but you're right that a lot of this terminology is misunderstood, and I think sometimes the best way to see how terminology should be used is to see how it shouldn't be used, first of all. Sometimes I see in discussions where the question of is morality objective or subjective is brought up, is that people say, well, no, you can't show that morality is objective, and I know that it's not objective because, as a matter of fact, morality differs from one culture to the next because, in fact, different cultures have different moral values. So the idea, I think incorrectly being presupposed there, is that morality is objective only if moral values are universally held the same. That's not what objectivity is about, because objectivity is about the fact that even if moral values differ from one culture to the next, in the sense that people have different beliefs from one culture to the next, objectivity says, well, in fact, some of those cultures could be mistaken. So you're right, it is a matter of there being moral facts of the matter. In fact, when I do get involved in debates about morality, I don't speak in terms of values, and that's just because people can confuse the idea of there being objective moral values with there being things that people value that are objectively the same. Because value is also a verb. What do you value? Well, obviously what everyone values is going to be different. And so I prefer to speak in terms of there being moral facts. The idea that morality is objective is the idea that there are moral facts of the matter about which people can be mistaken. I think that's the heart of moral objectivity.
So in a sense, there's a true north, and the question is whether or not you've got a properly functioning compass, as it were.
That's a good analogy, yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, here's another little question. So we have objective morals, but aren't they also relative? Because, it would depend on what they are grounded in, but it doesn't mean that relativism is true. Do you follow me there?
Yeah, I do follow you there. But I don't think that really shows that morality isn't objective. I recall there was a debate, I think it was last year, between a friend of mine, Matthew Flanagan, and a longtime philosopher, Raymond Bradley. And Raymond Bradley attempted to claim that, well, really, if you believe that morality is grounded in God, then you're a relativist, because you think that morality is relative to what God thinks, and that's relativism. But that's not relativism. Relativism is the idea that there can be multiple equally valid points of view, and that's not at all what you're saying if you're saying that morality is grounded in one and only one thing. And so I think that's a mistake. It's like saying, I've built a house, but the fact that the house is dependent on what I wanted to do, it's relative. It's a relative belief that there is a house here. Well, no, that's clearly mistaken. Yes, the house is dependent on me, but it's dependent on me for its existence, and it actually has existence regardless of what anyone else thinks. And I think that's the way to think about God being the ground of morality. It's because God exists, morality can exist. But the point is, it does exist. It's not the kind of thing that you can say is different from the way it is without being mistaken. So yes, morality is related to God, but just being related doesn't make something a relative point of view.
Now, why use the word objective? I've heard a lot of people want to revert to saying absolute morals. Do you see a difference there?
Potentially, and again, not everyone uses terms in the same way. Provided it's used carefully, I have no problem with that. One of the first books that I read that really dealt with the subject, and it was a very popular level book, was by Frank Beckwith and Greg Kokel, called Relativism, Feet Planted Firmly in Midair. Mm-hmm. And it contrasted relativism with absolutism. And the way that was done there is fine, as long as by absolutism you only mean that something is just true, absolutely, as a matter of fact, whether you like it or not. But there is another way of talking about absolutism, and that's in a kind of Kantian sense, where there are deeds, there are acts which are absolutely a matter of duty, and context almost doesn't matter. At least that's the way Kant is sometimes thought of. Mm-hmm. And so they say, well, that's a much stronger claim than moral objectivity, because moral objectivity might say that, there are moral ends that can be met by certain actions, and so lying, for example, is usually wrong, but there may be certain exceptions to the rule. For example, the classic example, the Nazis knock on your door, are there any Jews here? You say no. Now, you can be a moral objectivist and believe that that's perfectly fine, but there are some senses of moral absolutism where you say, no, we've made a rule about lying and it applies without exception. And so that's why sometimes it might be clearer to say that you believe in moral objectivity rather than moral absolutism.
So to clarify, sometimes people, when they say moral absolutes, they might be referring to actions you're going to take no matter what. There's no negotiating.
Yeah. I mean, I would rather not use the term that way because I don't think it's helpful. But, I realize that people do.
Okay, so more terminology to bug you with here. What's the difference? Now, this one I think is, if there was only one I was going to talk about with you, it would be this one, because I always see it to be a constant source of misunderstanding in these debates when people get up in the Q&A. William Lane Craig will always have to come back and say, no, you're confusing moral epistemology with moral ontology. It's a constant source of misunderstanding. But I think once people understand the difference properly, it brings such clarity, and their own confusions will dry up. So talk about the difference between moral ontology and moral epistemology.
Yeah. At the risk of explaining terminology with more terminology, moral ontology is about what's called metaphysics. So moral ontology is about there being states of affairs that make certain states of affairs possible. So if we're asking about moral ontology, we're saying, how could it be that moral facts are the way they are? Whereas moral epistemology is, how can we come to find out that moral facts are the way they are? And the way that I've seen the confusion arise sometimes is when I might say, look, the moral argument is that unless God exists, then there couldn't really be any moral facts. And an atheist, or even just a Christian who isn't sure about the moral argument, might come back and say, well, doesn't that mean that unless you believe in God, you can't know the difference between right and wrong, or you can't live a moral life? And so what they're saying is, unless God is not required ontologically to ground moral facts, then no one would know what was right and wrong unless they believe in God. And that's where they're confusing the two things, because you can believe that God is what makes moral facts possible, but you can also believe that God makes it possible for everyone to realize that there are moral facts. Let me give you an example. Back in pre-scientific times, or even I guess in some parts of the world now, there are people who live in the bush. The Bushmen of the Kalahari. I don't know. I assume there really is such a thing. Now, they don't know much about internal biology, so they don't realize that it's the fact that we have a windpipe and lungs that enables us to breathe. But that happens to be the case. Without those things, we couldn't breathe. And yet they can breathe. So the fact that they don't believe in the ontological basis for our ability to breathe doesn't stop them from knowing that we can breathe. And in a similar way, God has created morality, but not everyone knows that God creates morality. So they're like people who don't know that we have lungs, and yet they're still able to breathe. They're still able to take part in the moral life and realize that these moral facts exist. It's just that they can't give a correct account of why they're there. It's like if I found an alien spaceship in the middle of the forest, I would know that it was there, even if I didn't know how it got there. So we shouldn't confuse the epistemological issues with the ontological issues, which is, unfortunately, still quite common. And this surprises me, but even in the scholarly literature, for example, there's a philosopher named Wes Morriston who claims that the moral argument, and in particular divine command ethics, which is a theory that I hold, makes it impossible, or at least difficult, for unbelievers to know that there are moral facts. In fact, I'm submitting a paper for publication, fingers crossed, not that I'm superstitious, addressing that very objection called, divine command ethics and the epistemological objection, where I try to show that the fact that morality is ontologically grounded in divine commands doesn't mean that we have no access mentally to those facts unless we believe in God. So that's the distinction there.
I suppose back to our illustration of the compass, there being a true north, the ontology, is different than you knowing which way north is, the epistemology of it. Now, this issue of how we ground moral values or duties, what exactly is grounding? Why do you need something to be grounded?
If you're a relativist, like an outright relativist, who thinks that there really are no moral facts of the matter, you're a nihilist or an error theorist, as the labels go. So you think that there are all these moral claims, but none of them is true. Then you don't need any grounding, because you don't believe that there are any truths to be grounded. But grounding is required in order for something to be a fact. I think Socrates put it as clearly or as unclearly as some people might regard it when he spoke about truth by saying the essence of truth is to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not. In other words, it's a correspondence relationship. So what you say is only true as a matter of fact if it corresponds to the way that the world really is. So that's how truths are grounded. But there is another sense of grounding as well, where we talk about states of affairs being grounded or brought about by other states of affairs. And so some things aren't obvious, then they're not a matter of definition. They're not analytically true, like moral claims. It's not true by definition that it's morally wrong to engage in homicide or terrorism or what have you. And so you have to say, okay, well, if it's not just a matter of definition, then why is it true? What actually causes it to be true if it is true? Because just uttering the phrase doesn't show that it's true. So it has to be true for some reason. And so I guess it's analogous to the way that people talk about the principle of sufficient reason. What is it? What is the reason that it's true to say that engaging in homicide is wrong? So grounding is only required, as I say, if you believe that certain things are true. If things aren't true, then there's nothing to ground.
Do you think that Sam Harris, if he tries to make the foundation of morality based upon human flourishing, does that give sufficient grounds, or am I thinking of that correctly? Is that what he's attempting to do?
I think that's what he thinks he's attempting to do, but I think he's quite confused. He thinks he's discovered the ground of morality, but he hasn't. What he's done is he said, look, there are certain states of affairs that are good for us. Look, there's the word good. So now we know what good is. So let's promote that which is good. But I think he's actually skipped the question of moral grounding altogether. Bill Craig tried to point this out to Harris in the debate. I've tried to point it out in the past, but I don't know if Sam Harris realizes that it's the case, or if he's got a lot invested in this argument now, so he's got to just charge on ahead with it. I think he skips the question of grounding in the following way. He says there are certain things that are good, there are certain things that are bad. A striking example that he uses is, imagine a universe where everyone suffers as much as they can. He said, if we have a duty to do anything at all, we have a duty to avoid that, because that's bad. But I think he skipped the first step, because he says, if we have a duty to do anything, well, wait a minute, who says we have a duty to do anything? So what he's doing is he's saying, look, I think that we should promote the good. Here's what the good is, so let's promote it. Well, why do you think we have a duty to promote it? What's the grounding of that duty? So I think he's identifying, and quite correctly identifying, that which we have a duty to do, but he's not really trying. It doesn't look like he's trying to give an account of why we have a duty to promote it. He just takes it as epistemologically obvious. Like, we all have access to this fact that we should do something, but he's not really giving an ontological account of why we should do it. So I don't even think he's giving an account of grounding, let alone a false account.
We see that maybe Harris hasn't really grounded his moral system, but someone might ask, why must moral values be grounded in God? Why can't it be grounded in something else?
Well, I think that there's nothing else that really makes morality objective in the appropriate sense. Now, giving a full account of morality is somewhat convoluted, but here's a condensed version of my take on the moral argument, and I think it gives a good account of why it needs to be God, or else something so much like God that it may as well be God. I think that if there are moral facts, then the best way to think of them is not being grounded in nature, but rather in something outside of nature, and that's because nature can only tell us the way that things are. Nature is investigated by science. It tells us what states of affairs exist, but it really doesn't tell us what states of affairs in nature should exist. And I think that, moreover, the best way to think of a non-natural grounding of morality is in terms of a conscious or intelligent source of morality. And the reason is, I don't think that the whole Platonic or impersonal grounding of morality works for a couple of reasons. One, and this is one that Robert Adams does a pretty good job of explaining in a much fuller sense than I could in a format like this, but that morality has a social element to it, and that is when you engage in immorality, you're always wronging someone. There's some relationship that is being betrayed. And ultimately, I think Adams does a good job of explaining why that relationship isn't just a relationship between you and your fellow man, because there are, if you like, wrongs that you can engage in that don't directly offend against your fellow man. And this is something that I haven't seen developed so much, but I don't think that an impersonal Platonic basis of moral duty works, because morality or moral demands are intentional in nature. That is, they really are forward-looking. They're teleological. They have intentions about the way that we ought to live. It's not just some exemplar that we're living up to. Now, goodness, and I don't mean to get too technical here, but goodness in general, I think, can be thought of in a Platonic sense, where there is such a thing as the good or the ideal, but not the moral. And that's because moral is about duty. Morality calls us to do certain things. And so I think there are intentions bound up with the fact of moral duties that can't be explained in terms of anything non-personal. Now, I realize that I'm being incredibly summary in nature, but this is the nature of the argument that I would appeal to. So I think that the best way of accounting for moral duties is in terms of something that A, isn't natural, and B, is personal. So in terms of a non-natural person. Now, I think that there are good reasons for thinking that there is a non-natural person apart from this as well, but I also think that God makes special sense of moral duties, because if there is a God who created the universe, then there is something that we are here for. If you're an Aristotelian or someone who's into Thomas Aquinas, you'd express this in terms of speaking of final causes. There is a reason that we are here. Why are we here? Well, here's the reason. Of course, if atheism is true, then there isn't actually a reason that we are here. There may be causes of our existence, but there's no actual reason for our being here. We can do anything we like, and we're not violating our reason for existence because we don't have one. To use more modern language, in fact, the terminology of Alvin Plantinga, we have a proper function. But we can only have a proper function if there is an intention behind our existence. And I don't think that anything other than theism can account for this, which is something I think Alvin Plantinga, not so much in the context of ethics, but more broadly argues quite effectively for in his trilogy of books on the concept of warrant. But I think that this means that you can't just ground morality in any old thing. It has to be something that isn't natural, is personal, and gives us a basis for believing that there is a proper function of, the universe, but more specifically of us. And I don't think that anything other than theism meets those criteria.
Well, interestingly enough, in that debate with Sam Harris, he seemed to get really on this track of discussing Old Testament ethics and leaving the whole issue of, what's the source of morality, something natural or something supernatural. So, briefly, why is Old Testament ethics a separate issue from the grounding issue?
Yeah, it seems that every time you want to bring up the fundamental metaphysical issue of what grounds morality per se, there is a red herring or a distracting argument that comes up with something that God has done or your God is alleged to have done is immoral, as a matter of fact. Look at the Old Testament. Now, I think that there are good arguments to be made in regards to Old Testament ethics. Paul Copen's book, Is God a Moral Monster? Also, my friend Matt Flanagan has done some decent work on offering some explanations of why, in fact, these alleged moral atrocities of the Old Testament might not be the moral atrocities that many people take them to be. But setting that aside, I think that whole issue is a distraction because they are species of moral actions. They take for granted the whole ontological grounding of morality to begin with. They assume that, in fact, there can be moral facts. But the moral argument is about whether or not there can be such moral facts to begin with. It's like arguing about whether or not cars can exist at all, and then saying, well, cars can't exist because just look at the Edsel. What an awful car that is. Well, you can only talk about whether or not it's an awful car if cars exist. And so I think that's kind of, by pointing out that there are certain things that you think are objectively morally wrong, in a sense, the theist could say, aha, so you grant my point. There are moral facts. Now let's get back to talking about why there are moral facts. So it really skips past first base, if you like, and tries to get a home run before you've even gotten through the issue of whether or not baseball can exist.
Well, here's an objection that always comes up, the old Euthyphro dilemma. Why do you think this keeps coming up? Because, hasn't this been adequately answered by now?
It keeps coming up because people want to talk about philosophy without studying it. The manner in which it comes up, I think, confirms for me the superficiality that some people have when it comes to discussing the relationship between God and morality. It's become the kind of thing where someone who posts on an internet forum can claim to be an expert on the basis of the fact that he's heard someone on some other internet forum say something. I kid you not, I've seen this argument come up basically, maybe verbatim, but close to verbatim, along the lines of, God can't be the basis of morality, in brackets, see Euthyphro. And that's the end of the argument. And I'm thinking, you can't be serious. The Euthyphro dilemma comes up in the work of Plato as he's, relating a discussion of Socrates. Whether Socrates had this discussion, I don't know. But it's the idea that there is a kind of dilemma that you're forced into if you say that morality depends on God, because you have to answer the question, well, is morality moral? Are good things good just because God loves them? Or does God love things because they're morally good? And so you've got to make this awful choice. If you say that God loves things because they're good, well, then God's not the source of morality after all. Because God is already recognizing the morality of certain things. Whereas if you say that things are moral just because God likes them or wants you to do them, then you're in this terrible place where you have to admit, well, God could command you to torture babies for fun, and that would be good. What a ridiculous position to hold. And so you have to make one of these unpleasant choices. But I think it's a mistaken way of thinking about morality, and I think making clear distinctions between what is good and what is morally right helps us here, because we can say, no, God commands things because he loves them, and he loves them because they're good, but that doesn't mean that God is commanding because he is morally bound to by that which is morally good, because God is not morally good. God loves us, and because God actually cares for us, he loves that which is good for us in a non-moral sense. He wants us to flourish. He wants us to be ultimately happy. And so he likes, if you like, the things that make us happy. Now, he isn't morally bound to do that. It's because of his character as a loving God. And so he commands based on his character and based on his desires. He says, you shall not commit murder, because he knows that that's not good for us. But the fact that it's not good for us isn't a moral fact. It's an observation that anyone can make. And so I think that we don't have to face this dilemma and say, oh, no, we're in a real pickle now. We can say, well, it's not really a dilemma. Things are moral because God commands them, and that doesn't have the atrocious consequences that some people think it does.
Let's shift over to the moral argument that one that William Lane Craig commonly uses is, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. but objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. When you look at this argument, what are your observations, and what do you think are its strengths or possible weaknesses?
Well, I think the fundamental strength is that it's sound. The premises, I think, are all true, and the argument is valid, and that the conclusion does logically follow. The only weakness someone would say is that all by itself it's not very persuasive, but it's not presented all by itself. Bill Craig defends the premises. In particular, he defends the first premise, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. The premise number 2 is, I think, where some atheists would have their only real hope of rebutting the argument by saying, because the premise here says, but objective moral values and duties do exist. They could just say, well, no, they don't. And to be honest, Bill doesn't really offer much by way of argument for those premises, but it's kind of difficult to do so, I think, because how do you argue, for example, that the physical world exists and it's not just an illusion? I think it would be pretty hard to argue that that's the case, because anything you could appeal to, in order to argue for that, would be some observation about the physical world, because that's the world that we inhabit. And of course, anyone can just say, yeah, it appears that way, but it's not really that way because it's an illusion. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a lazy way of saying, of a ridiculous skeptic saying, well, nothing's real. Everything that appears to be real, yes, it appears that you're right, but you're wrong.
Well, one of the things that is a common response that I'll hear from skeptics, and they just go nuts over, is when he would say, but certain things are really wrong, and deep down we all know it.
Yeah.
But isn't it a fact that he's referring to the way we apprehend these moral values or duties is that we intuit them. That's how we observe them.
Nothing wrong with that. It's like saying, I know that objects exist, and so do you, because the fact is you can just see them. Well, that's okay. You can see them.
Do you think there are any other ways where, this moral argument can be formulated or rephrased? Could it be made clearer or more understandable or more persuasive?
Certainly it could be made clearer. Only by making it fuller. I think the argument is only intended, given those 3 propositions, one of them being the conclusion, it's only intended as a very brief summary, but it can be made clearer. I think that instead of this 3-proposition argument, it can be expanded somewhat, but not too much, into a 5-proposition argument. Now, of course, each of these propositions will still need defending. Every proposition does, but I would say this. If there are moral facts, then their basis is either natural or supernatural. And I mean supernatural and natural to be construed as mutually exclusive. So supernatural, you could just think non-natural. Premise number 2, the basis of moral facts is not natural. Now, that's the one that's going to need a reasonable amount of defense, and that's what you would do during the debate. Premise number 3, therefore, if there are moral facts, then their basis is supernatural. Number 4, the most plausible way to think of a supernatural basis of moral facts is in terms of a supernatural person who brings moral facts about. I said something about this earlier on. Premise number 5, therefore, if there are moral facts, the most plausible way to think of their basis is in terms of a supernatural person to bring moral facts about. Now, notice that I didn't say in that argument that moral facts exist. That's the kind of thing that I hope people already believe. Because the truth is, if you get someone who is willing to cut off their nose to spite their face and say, no, moral facts don't exist, I dig in my toes, then you're not going to, at least on paper, as they say, you're not going to persuade them. But you will persuade most people listening because they know full well that moral facts do exist.
In your experience, what do you think are the most common misconceptions or misunderstandings people have about the overall moral argument?
I think the most common misconception about the moral argument is a fairly popular level one, and that is something we talked about earlier, the confusion between epistemology and ontology. It's the idea that you're somehow saying that Christians, or at least theists, but they know I'm a Christian, so they say, you're saying that Christians are more moral than atheists, or they've got a better knowledge of morality. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that Christianity is true, otherwise there wouldn't be a Christian, and I think that as such, Christian revelation, namely the Bible, has a lot of good moral insight that other people have access to but choose to ignore. And so, yeah, look, because people who are Christians pay more attention to that, there's a good chance that they will know or at least appreciate certain moral truths that other people won't. And that's why there are genuine differences in moral belief between Christians and those who aren't in general. But we agree far more than we disagree. And so I think the biggest misunderstanding is the idea that when I claim that God makes morality possible, I'm claiming something morally about those who believe in God, which is not the case. I know Christians who are jerks. I wish that weren't the case, but it is the case. And I know atheists who are very fine people. And I think that's what needs to be made clear. I mean, I think it's clear enough. It ought to be clear. But because I think perhaps there's some kind of psychological appeal, people will attack the moral argument that way. It needs to be made clear that that is not at all what is being suggested by the moral argument. In fact, you could say the moral argument exists to explain why there are so many good moral people and you can list a whole bunch of good atheists and say, here's an explanation of why it is that we recognize that these people are actually moral. So I think that needs to be stressed. Just, I guess, to stop people from having the foothold of misunderstanding it and misrepresenting it that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, this whole discussion of morality and the moral argument has been fascinating, so I'm definitely going to point people to some of the resources on your blog. And I also want to point people to your recent lecture that you featured on your blog, which I also picked up on the topic of divine command ethics. Now, we're not going to open up a whole nother subject here, so I won't have you expand on it. But just if you could briefly just say, why do you think, from the perspective of one who is a Christian apologist defending the faith, why do you think understanding divine command theory is useful and helpful?
I think it's useful because you get to the point where you've made the argument, okay, without God there can't be any such thing as moral facts. But that doesn't by itself tell us what moral facts are. And this is where I think the work of Robert Merrihew Adams is really good, because his book, Finite and Infinite Goods, is not just a defense of divine command ethics. It's a defense of moral realism from a Christian point of view. So if you are a Christian, how should you think about what's right and wrong? Because the question of how you should think about right and wrong is fundamentally an important human question. Divine command ethics, I think, also has a lot of appeal. Now that may seem strange because it gets attacked a lot, but I think to normal human beings, not philosophers, divine command ethics does have a lot of appeal because it captures, I think, the basic features of morality, namely that morality is about living up to certain demands. It is prescriptive. It makes requirements of us. And so it has a lot in common, just on a psychological level, with what commands are. And so people say, okay, morality seems like rules. It seems like a list of commands. And the divine command ethicist like me can say, well, yeah, that's because it is. And so I think it has an intuitive appeal when you're explaining to people what morality is all about. Whereas contrast that with some sort of Platonic view of morality where, well, morality is all about living up to or being like the form of that which is good, which is this non-personal, immaterial thing that just exists for no reason. You kind of, what? That doesn't make any sense at all. And so I think divine command ethics really connects with normal people.
Seeing this as one of your areas, Glenn, what progress do you hope to see in this field in the future?
That's a good question, because I think that huge amounts of progress have been made over the last few decades, since in particular since the 70s, when people like Robert Adams or the late great, as I call him, Philip Quinn, have been doing their work on divine command ethics, because I think all the real objections have been addressed. I mean, well and truly addressed. I guess the kind of progress I'd like to see is for people to realize this, because they keep coming up. In both the popular literature, which is understandable, but lamentably in the university as well. And I think what needs to happen is there needs to be, I guess, just more of a proliferation of reminders. I mean, I've got a paper that I'm working on, and it hasn't been published anywhere yet. Maybe it will one day, but it's called "Is There an Echo in Here?" And it's like my main point is, look, divine command ethics has been spelled out and defended in the following ways. These objections were initially offered, but now they've been addressed. But is there an echo in here? Because they keep coming up time and time again. So I guess the kind of progress that I want to see is a bit like stamping out a bushfire. It just keeps popping up in different places.
Finally, as we wrap up here, is there any sort of advice you'd want to give to Christian apologists today?
Yeah. Don't have too much confidence. Now, people might think, what? Hang on a minute. I didn't see that coming. Let me explain. You can have a lot of confidence that the Christian worldview is intellectually defensible, because it really is. Obviously, I'm soundly committed to that claim. But I think that some apologists, and particularly on the internet, because anyone can be an apologist on the internet. Websites are easy to set up, and you've got a free podium. Don't assume that because the Christian faith is intellectually defensible, that whatever you say in defense of the Christian faith is therefore defensible. Because it might not be. And, even accomplished philosophers sometimes say things that make other philosophers cringe. So you should really keep watch on yourself that you don't become flippant or arrogant in your defense of the Christian faith because of your confidence that the Christian worldview is correct. Because that can lead to, it can lead to people seeing, or at least gaining the perception, that Christians defend their faith with lousy arguments, and therefore the Christian worldview is not defensible after all. Really take the time to pursue excellence in the way that you defend the Christian worldview. And never assume that because Christians agree with the arguments or conclusions that you offered, that they're therefore defensible, and therefore anyone's going to see them and be immediately flawed and knocked down by them. So I guess that's something that I would say, because I really am bothered when I see Christian apologetics that embarrasses me. And that's not an attempt, to say, look, my method of apologetics is better than anyone else, because I think what I'm saying is the kind of thing that any Christian apologist, in theory, should appreciate. Be careful, because there is a lot at stake. And if you come across as a representative of the Christian worldview with a huge amount of confidence and arguments that aren't that good, that kind of reinforces the idea that faith just means believing for bad reasons. And that is precisely the kind of stereotype that Christian apologists exist in order to dispel.
Glenn, excellent advice. I really appreciate you taking the time to do the interview, and I wish you all the best in the continued growth of your blog and your podcast.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the work you do as well. It's something that I often refer people to. So, I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you.
Thanks. I've been speaking with Dr. Glenn Peoples, New Zealand-based Christian philosopher, podcaster, and blogger. Be sure to check out his Beretta blog and his Say Hello to My Little Friend podcast. Links to those resources and more can be found at today's blog post at Apologetics315. If you've enjoyed today's interview, please share it with a friend via Facebook or Twitter, and remember to subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, as podcast episodes are released a day in advance of their blog posting. While you're in iTunes, please leave a positive review. This is Brian Oughton of Apologetics315, and thanks for listening.